Hi again, everyone. This is Marc Movsesian. I'm the co-director of the Center for Law and Religion at St. John's. I'm joined once again by my friend and colleague, the center's other co-director, Marc DeGirolami, for an episode of Legal Spirits, which is our podcast series on cases and issues in law and religion. You can find past episodes archived on Apple iTunes and Android and Spotify and other streaming platforms, and also on our website, lawandreligionforum.org. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm well, thanks. How are you doing? It's good to be
Uh,
together.
it's good to be together again. It's been a while since the last podcast. Well, we thought today for our podcast we do something a little different. This podcast is not about law specifically, but it's generally in our wheelhouse. I think we're going to talk about a very famous essay by C.S. Lewis called "Learning in Wartime," which Lewis wrote at the start of World War II. And this essay was the subject of our most recent Reading Society meeting, which was led by one of our guests, actually, by Marc Lanier, who's a very well-known trial lawyer and also Christian educator and the founder of the Lanier Theological Library in Houston, Texas. And Marc brought with him an original manuscript of the essay and very kindly hosted us and the Reading Society at his New York law office. We really are very grateful for that. And Marc and I, that is Marc DiGirolami and I, thought that it might be a nice idea to do a podcast on it. Now, the essay is a reflection on the calling of the student. And I think, Marc, it's fair to say not just the student, but the professor too, but the scholar also. And Lewis asks, why bother to study? Why bother to be a scholar when there's a war on, where we all have more immediate concerns to think about and we may soon be dead? And Lewis's answer is a specifically Christian one, but I think, Marc, don't you agree that it has broader implications for non-Christians as well?
I think that's true, and it's a nice reflection for anyone, irrespective of a religious conviction. It has perhaps special application, as you say, or special insight for those who are Christian. But I think it's actually quite ecumenical in the message and what it talks about. And in some ways, its question is, what is the value of knowing? What is the value of knowledge? Why do this particular activity when there are so many other concerns? So just as it can reach more people than Christians, this is sort of a timeless question. So too, it also reaches deeper than simply the question of war or not war. The inquiry is about more broadly the question of the pursuit of knowledge when there are so many other concerns that might occupy and that do occupy our time and interest.
Yeah, I think that's right, Marc. So let's talk about this a little bit. The essay is adapted from a sermon that Lewis delivered in Oxford at St. Mary's Church in Oxford a few days after the start of World War II in September 1939. And Lewis asks the question, which surely many people in that church were asking, what is the point of what we are doing here? What is the point of being students at Oxford University when there's a war starting and the whole nation is swept up in excitement and there are grave issues to consider, and we will soon be called up and we may soon be dead. Why are we bothering to do this? And Lewis begins his answer by saying, well, first of all, this is the wrong perspective. This is the wrong perspective because although this seems like a new situation full of new dangers and new distractions, in fact, it isn't. In fact, it isn't. Lewis says the war doesn't really create any new situation. The world is always burning. The world always has problems, and the chance for all of us is 100%. So it's not a question of, well, now death is imminent. Death is really always present for us. And so we should be asking ourselves that question at all times. Why are we doing what we are doing? And so specifically, why are we as scholars pursuing this particular calling? Marc?
And this is why, in some ways, we say, or we I mean, you and I believe that the essay reaches beyond the question of war proper, even though, of course, it is true that at the moment there are major actual war, conflagrations of war going on in Europe, in the Middle East, and so on. While we don't have that in the United States, we have had a situation of great anxiety, of great tragedy, of great trouble over the last few years that has, well, in COVID-19 that has occupied us. We've had racial unrest and questions, major questions of racial injustice that have occupied our attention, where it really has seemed to many that the world is on fire. What are we doing here in the university when there's so many more pressing, more important concerns to attend to in the world all around us?
Right, that's a nice point. And we should say, Mark, we first thought about doing this essay actually in the summer of 2020 when the world was on fire for so many reasons. As you say, the pandemic, concerns about racial injustice, and it took us a while to get this scheduled because of the issues involved there, but we were able to get this scheduled finally. Okay, so Lewis asks the question, well, why should we be concerned with learning? Why should we be scholars? And his first answer is, well, that is the human condition, right, Mark? It is the human condition to want to do these things.
That's right, and it reminds me in some respects. I'm teaching a jurisprudence course for the first time this year. In some ways, in response to what I sensed from students, was precisely a desire to get at some of these deeper issues about the connection of law to politics, to morality, to questions of justice, and so on. And one of the lines that especially struck me was the very first line of Aristotle's Metaphysics, where Aristotle says, "All men by nature desire to know," and so this is in some ways picking up on this particular feature of, or I should say, Lewis picks up on this particular idea in Aristotle that is simply a part of human nature. By the way, human nature, which is a very central part of the study of jurisprudence. What is a human being? Why does a human being? Why is it a distinct creature? What are its natural drives, let's say, what impels a human being? What distinguishes it as a human being from other animals? So this first answer that he gives is in some way picking up the classical answer that it's simply a part of human nature. It is better to know things, better for human beings to know things than to remain in ignorance. So, but he doesn't stop there, of course.
No, he doesn't stop there. He says this is our essential nature. He says that we want to know the latest poem when we're scaling the walls of Quebec, right? We comb our hair at Thermopylae. We are interested in beauty. We are interested in knowledge. But for a Christian, that's not the only answer, because of course for Christians this is a fallen world, and the fact that you have an appetite doesn't mean it is a correct appetite. And so he says for Christians we have to ask ourselves, does this desire we have, is it consistent with the Christian life? I mean, he poses the question, shouldn't Christians just be concerned about the next world and eternal salvation? And he says no. And he says, first of all, he says God creates no appetite by accident, and so there must be something useful in this desire to know. But he says, whatever that appetite is, as Christians, we have to reconcile it with our ultimate calling, which is to worship God and to seek eternal life. And he says, herein lies a paradox, the paradox of Christianity, which is that this life doesn't matter, the things of this world don't matter on the one hand, but on the other hand, they matter quite a lot, because we are all going to be judged ultimately for how we have responded to our calling and what we have done. So, Mark, what do you think about that? How does Lewis resolve this paradox?
Well, I think I'm not sure that he resolves it, but the way that he addresses it ultimately in the essay, he says, look, the life of the mind, so to speak, is one life in which we can be of service to God, in which we can do things humbly in the Lord. There are many callings, and one can do things humbly in the Lord without devoting. Absolutely, he's clear about this. There's nothing sort of special or sort of distinctively or in a more elevated way Christian about devoting one's life to God in the life of the mind. That one can serve God in many different kinds of ways. but this is one kind of way, one kind of way that one can achieve one's calling, let's say.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll just read what he says. It's a beautiful passage which tells us all in the university world we need to be humble. He says, "I reject at once an idea which lingers in the mind of some modern people, that cultural activities are in their own right spiritual and meritorious, as though scholars and poets were intrinsically more pleasing to God than scavengers." And, that's simply not true. He says, let us clear this forever from our minds. This is a dangerous and most anti Christian error. The work of a Beethoven and the work of a charwoman become spiritual on precisely the same condition, that of being offered to God, of being done humbly as to the Lord. This does not, of course, mean that it is for anyone a mere toss up whether he should sweep rooms or compose symphonies. A mole must dig to the glory of God, and a cock must crow. And he says, seems like this is your calling to the students. It seems like your calling is to be scholars. And so you should do it. There's nothing wrong with doing it. Don't be proud. Don't think your calling is any better than anybody else's, but there's nothing wrong with doing it. And I think, as you said, Mark, it's as long as you do things humbly in the Lord, you can pursue the things of this life.
And in fact, Mark, he even goes on to say, once you're pursuing this particular calling for your own glory, for your own, then it's time, and in a sort of a memorable phrase, to tear one of your eyes out, right? It's time to stop at that point. And so, in some ways, there's a memorable, reminds me of a memorable moment in a movie called Chariots of Fire from years ago. I don't know if you remember it,
Oh,
Mark,
sure.
where and there's a line attributed to Eric Liddell, who is this person who is an exceptional runner, and he says, and I think that the attribution may actually be apocryphal, but it's still a great line, which I think reflects or evokes some of Lewis's essay. He says, "When I run, I feel God's pleasure." Flowing through me. And I think that that's a very lovely metaphor for sort of understanding what it is that, not only that one can offer to God, but that one can reflect God's own nature by pursuing one's talents in a way that is pleasing to Him.
Yeah, I think that is nice. I hadn't thought about it till just now, though, Mark. But that might be a movie for us to watch with our students, because in some ways it's all about desiring religious exemption, right? Isn't that the point of the
Right.
movie? He doesn't want to run on the Sabbath,
That is true. That's exactly right. And he's not granted that exemption. Actually,
right?
someone
He's
else
not granted.
runs in his place.
Yeah, I haven't
But
seen it
anyway,
for a long
let's
time.
come back to the essay itself. It's
No,
sort
I
of
haven't. I haven't seen that for a long time. I should see the movie again.
so the idea then is that even though the war isn't anything new, it does sort of how to put it, raise the stakes, I suppose, right? Make our fate more immediate to us, or make things more acute than they otherwise would be.
Yeah, he says it's kind of a reality check, which is, in fact, as he begins the essay by saying, we talked about this, that this is human nature, it's human life. Life is always precarious. The world is always burning, and it's simply a kind of myopia that doesn't see that the world is always difficult and terrible, and we should always be asking ourselves why we are wasting time on trivialities like study when there are so many more pressing problems in the world. But he says the war is good in the sense that it reminds us of this. A lot of times he says the reason we don't think about these things is that we just distract ourselves. But we should think about the wise person always knows that life is short. It's just that the war, he says, now even the stupidest person knows this. That's his phrase, not mine. Even the stupidest person knows this now, that life is short and you have to do something with it. And I found this was interesting too, I think, in what he said, Mark. And now that I'm at that stage of life, I guess, he says, even in middle age, you see how many things are closing to you, that you just don't have time to pursue many worthwhile things.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean, I'm headed there myself
You're with
also,
me too.
and right, distractions are always present. But another line that really stuck with me is that excitements are always present. There's always, and this can happen, I think, particularly in law, as law is an academic field, where there's always the next lawsuit, the next Supreme Court case, the next controversy that stimulates the sort of popular excitement, and then people are screaming about it on Twitter one way or the other, and all of those, he says, excitements of one kind or another are one of the great enemies of the pursuit of the life of the mind, and has to be guarded against. You have to he recommends a series of mental exercises to avoid the stimulus, the bad stimulus of these various excitements. So that's one enemy, and another one is sort of despair, in some ways, which is the one that you're talking about.
Well, we'll get to despair. I think that as you're talking, I'm reflecting, of course, C.S. Lewis wrote this, decades before Twitter. But I mean, Twitter is, of course, that's what it's all about. It's the next exciting new thing, the next shiny new object that's going to distract your attention for a few hours and keep you from getting down to doing the serious work that you should be doing. I think that's really a very important point, Marc. Well, he talks about excitements, he talks about frustrations, and then he talks about something else, which is, I think, very interesting. And he says, the other thing that the war makes plain to us is just how fallen this world is, just how bad this world is, how one can be called away from one's pursuits, one can have one's dreams shattered, one can have one's life shortened by things you didn't expect, and he says this is also very useful to know. Now, he makes this is a specifically Christian point, and he ends on a specifically Christian point. After all, this is a sermon. But I wonder if some of our listeners who are not Christians might not find this same kind of the same observation important to reflect upon. And let me just read how he closes the essay. He says, "We see unmistakably," he's talking about the war, what the war has done. He says, "We see unmistakably the sort of universe in which we have all along been living and must come to terms with it. If we had foolish, unchristian hopes about human culture, they are now shattered. If we thought we were building up a heaven on earth, if we looked for something that would turn the present world from a place of pilgrimage into a permanent city satisfying the soul of man, we are disillusioned and not a moment too soon." He's alluding there to Hebrews, in which the author says, here we have no permanent city. But isn't it true of life right now, Marc, when we look around the world? If we had hopes about human culture, if we had hopes about a kind of utopia on earth, it's pretty hard to see how they have not been shattered by events of recent years and recent months.
Well, I tend to agree with you, and of course, um, those those kinds of events, terrible events, can stimulate various sorts of responses. I think in people, some people will search for the utopia all the more vehemently, or with all the more determination, or insist that it's out there, and that the destruction and the problems that one sees around oneself are all the more reason to find such a solution. And others will respond, as you suggest, differently. That such solutions aren't to be found in this world. That is in fact, it seems to me, that the one of the kinds of Christian responses, the Christian response that Lewis suggests, and it picks up on something, on another book that we have talked about in our reading society, in the City of God, in Augustine's City of God, where
Absolutely.
right where Augustine distinguishes as between the city, the heavenly city, and the earthly city, and says, for the Christian, we are not destined. Christians are not destined to be of this world, and we have to sort of always keep that in mind.
Yeah, well, so what you were talking about, I think, is the as you said. So this is a terrible world. Our hopes for human culture and human goodness are largely shattered. Um, so the one response might be work even harder, but that's kind of silly. The other response would be just give up and despair. But Lewis suggests that's also silly. So the fact that we are not permanent residents here, we as Christians, here we have no permanent city, doesn't mean you just don't do anything, just kind of wait around for the end or hope entirely in the next world. It is pursue your calling, whatever it is. If it's to be a scholar, be a scholar. If it's to be A delicatessen worker, be a delicatessen worker. If it's to be a doctor, be a doctor. If it's to be a driver, be a driver. I mean, do what you do, and leave the future to God. Do your best, leave it to Him. And here's how the essay ends. Remember, he's talking to the students. But if we thought that for some souls, and at some times, the life of learning, humbly offered to God, was in its own small way one of the appointed approaches to the divine reality and the divine beauty which we hope to enjoy hereafter, we can think so still. That is, that even the ugliness of this world should not prevent us from deriving joy from our calling.
Right. No, it's a lovely message, and it's a message in its controlled way of hope. It seems to me of hope for one's life here, and ultimately for one's life elsewhere.
Right. I agree with that. As I say, look, Lewis was a Christian. This was a sermon. He was writing a specifically Christian essay, but I do think that the question here about, well, why are we doing what we are doing? Especially, why are we doing what we're doing in this terribly fallen world in which we are living? I think that really should occur to everybody. And okay, not everyone's going to accept this Christian answer, of course, but it's, I think, important for everybody to think what his or her answer would be to that question.
No, I quite agree. And I think Lewis's description of the sort of immediacy of the coming of these questions during times of struggle and strife, I mean, I think just as a sort of as a description of what I've seen, for example, from some of my students, many of my students over the last few years, as a sharpening or a more acute interest in these kinds of matters. That's correct, Marc. That's true. I don't know if you agree with that, but I have seen a great increase in these deeper, more existential sorts of questions about what the function and purpose of all of our learning might be.
Well, in fact, Mark, I was very gratified by the response of the students in the Reading Society who really took to this essay and wrote to us after and wanted to talk about it more. Some of them are going through war in their own family lives in other countries. And I was impressed with how much this essay, written whatever it was 80 years ago now, had on people even today, which is why I think these questions really are timeless. And I'm glad that we did this essay.
No, I absolutely agree.
Okay, listeners. Well, as I say, this was a little different for us. We hope you enjoyed this podcast. I guess the next one we'll probably get back to our more normal agenda of cases and such. But I think it was important to talk about this. So for now, this is Marc Movsesian with my friend, my colleague, Marc DeGirolami, for another episode of Legal Spirits. You can find past episodes archived on your favorite streaming platform and also on our website, lawandreligionforum.org. See you next time.